Yes, we are. So, one last chance to get comfortable, get snacks, get hydrated.
Attend to medication or pets or foods as needed.
Oberon is indeed a poop.
That's getting clipped.
Chapter 26. My resolve was tested the next day. I was in the back, waiting for a pan of muffins to come out, and she bustled in. Mona, why are you hiding back here? People want to see you. I grimaced. There'd been a lot of that. I hadn't minded the regulars that first day, but people I didn't know kept showing up and wanting to hear the story. I didn't want to keep telling it. I wanted it to be over. I wanted people to buy scones because they were good, not because it was a chance to gawk at me. I'd rather not, Aunt Tabitha. I'm sure they're just here for bread. No, they're here for you, because you're a hero. She said it so nicely. She really meant it, but the word hero twisted up in my chest and I couldn't seem to breathe around it. I mumbled something about the muffins and fled down the stairs to the cellar. I sat on the steps with my head in my hands. Hero. I was 14. People had been trying to kill me. I hadn't done anything heroic. I'd been terrified. And yes, I know that line about how courage is going forward when you're scared, except that I hadn't even done that. I hadn't gone forward. I'd run away, and the only reason I'd gone to the Duchess was because I'd run out of ways to keep running away. Hero. It should never have come down to me. It was miserably unfair that it had come down to me and Spindle. There were grown-ups who should have stopped it. The Duchess should have found her courage and gone to the guards. The guards should have warned the Duchess. The council, whoever they were, should have made sure the Duchess knew about the proclamations. The Duchess should have had people on the street who reported back to her. Everyone had failed at every step, and now Spindle and I were heroes because of it. The door creaked open. I sniffled. I didn't want to talk to Aunt Tabitha. She meant well. She was proud of me. I didn't know how to explain that she shouldn't be proud. That it wasn't anything I'd meant to do. It was just that the whole city had fallen down on the job. But it wasn't my aunt. It was my uncle. Uncle Albert, who came and sat down on the step next to me, and I scooted over to make room. Uncle Albert. You never come down here. I wiped my eyes, probably leaving smears of flour. Bob's down here. Yeah, well, I heard your aunt talking to you. I thought I'd come down. I sighed. Do you want me to go apologise? Uncle Albert was always the peacemaker in the rare events that Aunt Tabitha and I argued. No, he said. That surprised me. A lot. I don't know if when you're an adult you can argue and be right, but if you're a kid and you argue with an adult, you are automatically wrong. Always. It's a law of nature or something. On the other hand, I'd been right about Oberon, so maybe the laws were in flux right now. She thinks I'm a hero, I said, when the silence had stretched out. But I shouldn't have had to do any of it. There should have been so many grown-ups who should have fixed things before it got down to me and Spindle. It doesn't make you a hero just because everybody else didn't do their job. Uncle Albert leaned back and put his elbows on the step behind us. I was in the army when I wasn't much older than you, he said. I glanced over at him, surprised. I knew this, but he didn't talk about it. Not in a deep, dark, secret way, just... The one time I asked as a kid, he laughed and said it was mostly boring and people yelled at you a lot. And the one time we really got in trouble was against Delta C, he said. He stared down the steps into the dimness. We were sort of at war then, I guess. Nobody was real clear on it at the time. Probably still aren't. Anyway, a bunch of us were stationed way out at the end of a peninsula and we were cut off by the enemy. They didn't send us any help. Nobody attacked us, not really. Occasionally we'd throw rocks over the wall at each other, just to, remind ourselves there was a war on. But we ran out of message pigeons, and we ran out of rocks. And then we ran out of food. Still, nobody came to save us. We thought there must have been a pitched battle or something, and maybe River Braid was overrun. Maybe no one was left to come save us. Eventually, the commander surrendered, because it was that or we'd all starve. He tilted his head back, looking at the ceiling. Dollar City was really polite about it. They ransomed us back. It turned out nobody knew we'd been in trouble. A couple of quartermasters had been siphoning off supplies that the brass fort was headed our way. All the messages we'd sent were sitting at the bottom of a stack of papers on somebody's desk. I stared at him in horror. Well, you can't really have that happening. It looks bad when people just forget you're there, so they decided it had been a siege. Called it the Siege of Dusk End, I think. They gave us medals for surviving, and we all went home, heroes of the war. That's terrible, I said. Yeah. Uncle Earl glanced over at me, but as long as they gave us medals, that fixed it, as far as the army was concerned. You expect heroes to survive terrible things. If you give them a medal, then you don't ever have to ask why the terrible thing happened in the first place. Or try to fix it. He made a flicking gesture with his fingers. How else are you going to have heroes? I rubbed my face. I'm sorry, I said. Suddenly my days in the church tower didn't seem so bad. How long had Uncle Earl and his men been trapped watching their supplies dwindle, waiting for help to come? Yeah, me too. I'm sorry we failed you, Mona. We tried to go to the Duchess, but I'm not even sure if they told her we were there. Probably they didn't. Should have occurred to me to try climbing a guard rope. You didn't fail, I said. They wouldn't let you succeed. That's different. He put his arm around me and squeezed. He's not much of a hugger, not like Aunt Tabitha, and it was awkward, but I felt better. I'll talk to your aunt, he said. We heroes have got to stick together. It got better after that. I don't know what he said to Aunt Tabitha, but she stopped asking me to talk to customers as much. Perversely, because she wasn't asking, it got easier to do. I even slept a little more at night, although not much. That mood continued up until the end of the week, when the doors were thrown open, and Joshua and Harold marched inside. I say marched because it was pretty clearly official. They were both wearing swords, and they stopped on either side of the door. Widow Holloway, who had come in for a blackberry muffin, leaned toward me over the bakery case and whispered, "My, such handsome young guards they have these days." Widow Holloway is going exceedingly deaf, so her whisper could have been heard halfway to the palace. I'll do that again. "My, such handsome young guards they have these days."
Content warning. Accents.
Widow Holloway is going exceedingly deaf, so her whisper could have been heard halfway to the palace. Joshua grinned, and the tips of Harold's ears turned pink. "Her Grace the Duchess," Joshua intoned, "to see Mona, the Wizard of the Bakery." Wizard of the Bakery. There's a title. Aunt Tabitha came out of the back to see what the commotion was, just as the Duchess came in the front door. "Mona, what's all this?" "Mona, my dear, forgive the disruption." They stared at each other over the bakery case. I could see...
I'm sorry, I can't not think of that.
I could see wheels turning in Aunt Tabitha's head, probably. "She looks familiar, but where have I seen her before? Oh, good Lord." She dropped into a curtsy, apron flapping. "Your Grace." "You must be Mona's Aunt Tabitha," said the Duchess, smiling warmly. "How wonderful to finally meet you. I am so very sorry for the agonies that you must have suffered while she was missing." Aunt Tabitha tried to say it was dreadful and it was nothing at the same time, and produced a garbled sentence that sounded vaguely like "Noverful thing." "I hope to have leisure to sample some of your delightful pastries soon," said the Duchess smoothly. I suspect she was used to overawed people. Probably happens a lot. Unfortunately, duty calls, and I must beg your leave to borrow Mona to consult with her on official business. Consult with her? Official business? Me? I didn't like the sound of that. It might be nothing. Probably it was just the knighthood she threatened me with. But despite her smile, there was a kind of tightness around the Duchess's mouth that I did not like. Still, it was the Duchess. I took off my apron. Aunt Tabitha levered herself to her feet, holding onto the edge of the bakery case. Begging your Grace's pardon, but you'll bring her back. I promise, said the Duchess, and the smile slipped a bit. Mona is not in any trouble. Indeed, I am hoping that she will be able to help us in our hour of need. Oh, well then, Aunt Tabitha gave me a quick, ferocious hug. Mind your manners, she whispered, and be careful. Then she swept up a box full of muffins, which were supposed to go to the knitting circle on 4th Street, and forced them into my hands. Maybe she thought they didn't feed people at the palace. I walked out the door between Joshua and Harold, following the Duchess. Through the open door, I could hear Widow Holloway shout in what she doubtless thought was a conspiratorial whisper. That was the Duchess? Didn't get her father's height, did she? Sorry, the Widow Holloway was briefly Traxel there.
Or Yoda. Can't quite tell.
Height of her father she did not have. It's true, said the Duchess mournfully. Father was 6'2". One of my great sorrows. It is easier to be imposing when you are tall. You seem to do all right, Your Grace. We were settling ourselves into the Duchess's carriage, which had less carvings and gilt than Oberon's, but still looked a bit like a cake on wheels, when a small, ragged figure launched himself from behind a water barrel on the corner. Spindle hit the door and clung to it like a squirrel. If you're going somewhere with Mona, I'm coming too, he announced. Joshua came around the side, sighed heavily, and picked him up by the scruff of the neck. We should not dream of leaving you behind, said the Duchess. You may stand as surety of our good behaviour. Spindle was dumped into the carriage. He straightened up, nodded to Joshua, and sat down on the bench next to me. What's going on, Your Grace? I asked as the wheels creaked into motion over the cobbles. What's all this hour of need business? The Duchess stared at her fingers.
Did you seriously just do that?
Yep. Do you know? No, you could not know, of course. Well, when someone is exiled from the city, we have them followed for a little time. We do this to make sure they do not immediately turn about and try to sneak back inside. I always wondered about that, said Spindle. Couldn't figure that you just let them go and not keep an eye on them. I was embarrassed to admit that I hadn't thought about that at all. So I just nodded. Well, the Duchess leaned back against the cushions. Our man followed Inquisitor Oberon. He travelled quickly, clearly with a direction in mind, and came to an encampment of Karak's mercenaries. I sat bolt upright on the seat. But I thought the army was supposed to be out fighting them, I said. Aren't they days and days away? Apparently not, said the Duchess grimly. I suspect that the army's intelligence has also suffered from Oberon's influence. As near as we can tell, the army was chasing a small group of Karaks, and the main body of the mercenaries are currently 2 days from here. 2 days! Caw, said Spindle, who'd broken into Aunt Tabitha's muffins. The bottom seemed to have dropped down my stomach and been left somewhere back on the cobblestones. What? 2 days? The Duchess nodded grimly. We're trying to avoid a panic while we wait for confirmation. So there's not been a general announcement, but yes, I believe in 2 days we will be in a state of siege. Oberon has found them. He must have been working with them all along and informed them that the army is gone, the mage is dead. The city ripe for the taking. Spindle has a quicker and twistier mind than me. Must have planned to take over in here first, then use the mercs to deal with the army. Then he get a whole city without fighting for it. Now he ain't going to get that, so he figures he'll burn it down and take what's left. He took a huge bite of muffin. The Duchess regarded him with a kind of weary amusement. Do you know, there may be a place for you in my cabinet, young Spindle. That is exactly what we believe he planned. It is a shame that none of us saw it sooner. Perhaps it never occurred to us that he might watch his own city sacked. She leaned back against the cushions. We sent riders out to find the army the day he was ousted, but without mages we no longer have instantaneous communication. It is to be hoped that when Master Gildean died, Lord Ethan will have realised that something was amiss at home. But even at our most hopeful estimates, they are 5 days away. 5 days. The Carracks were 2 days away. In 2 days, the Carracks could overrun the city. They say that when a Carracks goes past, his footprints fill up with blood. If what the Duchess said was true, the blood was going to be out. What do we do? I whispered. We have the palace guard, said the Duchess. We have the city walls, and we have one wizard left. One wizard left, but... Oh. Right. Me. I spent the rest of the ride to the palace coming up with reasons why I couldn't possibly save the city, why I probably couldn't do anything at all, why I was in fact no kind of wizard whatsoever. The Duchess listened to all this with a faint smile on her lips. My dear, she said finally, without the use of magic, you have managed to bring down a powerful traitor and recall a negligent ruler to her senses. I shudder to think what you might accomplish with the use of magic. Your Grace, I work with bread, I cried for about the 20th time as the carriage trotted into the palace courtyard. Just bread! Aren't there any other wizards? She shook her head sadly. I'm sure there are others in the city, but they are in hiding. All the talk of the curfew and a registry has frightened them badly, and no wonder. And now we are asking them to come to the palace. Why should they believe this is any different? I slumped back in the seat, defeated. The Duchess leaned forward and patted my knee. My dear, I am certain that you can go on and on about how unworthy and incapable you are for hours yet, but we have very little time. Let us pretend that we have done all of that, and that I have nodded correctly and made the proper noises, and skip to the point where you say, I don't know what I can do, but I will try. Spindle snickered. I said, but... bread! The palace kitchens are at your disposal, said the Duchess. I assume that you will need dough for whatever you do. We will set every bakery in the city to producing as much as they can for your use. Do you have any special instructions? She got out of the carriage on Joshua's arm. He helped me down too. Spindle jumped, and I handed him the rest of Aunt Tabitha's muffins. My mind reeled with images of the enormous palace ovens that I had passed during our trip to the scullery. You could bake huge things in there. Really huge things. The weakest may command a mountain, the book had said. Well, I'd wanted to make an elephant out of dough, hadn't I? Tell the bakeries to let the bread rise much further than they would otherwise, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Let it overflow the pans. We need size. Spindle, I need you to go back to my room and get the book on the nightstand and a change of clothes for me. Tell Aunt Tabitha I'll be gone overnight. Your Grace, I don't know what I can do, but I'll do my best. Literally every chapter of this thing ends that well, from here on in, by the way.
Give the chapter numbers as well. So
I know, I will. 27. If you have ever prepared for a siege in 2 days, then you know what the next few days were like. If you haven't, then you probably don't. Well, a big formal wedding is about the same, and because we do cakes, I've been on the periphery of a few of those, except that if things go wrong in a siege, you'll all die horribly, and in formal weddings, the stakes are much higher. That's my favourite joke in the entire book, by the way. We had a bride threaten to set the bakery on fire once when her buttercream frosting came out the wrong colour. My plan was simple. I was going to make gingerbread men, or at least bread men. They probably didn't need more than a token amount of ginger, except that instead of being 4 inches tall, they'd be 14 feet tall. Even the big palace ovens couldn't do bread that size, so the blacksmiths were creating a kind of giant, outdoor, vaguely humanoid cookie sheet. 12 enormous shields, hammered flat, bolted together, resting on top of a trench filled with coals and manned by teams of apprentices with bellows. The result wasn't pretty, and I had no idea if it was going to work. I suspected that my bread warriors would be black and burnt on the bottom and raw in the middle, but I had to pretend to know what I was doing. The head blacksmith was a swarthy man named Argonel, and he was brilliant. He had a voice like stones grinding wheat, and his hands were scarred and hideous, and he didn't act like it was strange at all to take orders from a terrified 14-year-old girl. He was the one who suggested the outdoor cookie sheet. I was trying to figure out whether I could bake them in parts in the oven and then cement them together somehow. Icing, maybe. Although, if working with icing gives me a headache normally, that would probably have sent me into a 10-day migraine. And Argonel listened carefully and said, "We can do this. Show us how large you want your golems. We'll make your oven." Golems? I hadn't thought of them that way before. I'd run across the word in Spiraling Shadows, but I hadn't connected it to my cookies. When I had a moment, I pulled out the book and looked up the section on golems. An unliving thing brought to life, golems are often sculpted from clay, mud, or stone, or cast in plaster or bronze. Golems have been created of water and air, although this is very difficult. Golems can be crude or finely detailed, and are usually in the shape of men, although there are notable exceptions, such as the feather bird golems of Ganefar the Winged. My own little gingerbread golem had hitched a ride in my shirt pocket and spent the first day riding around on my shoulder, observing things. Yes. "What do you think?" I asked him, quite aware that this was ridiculous. The book was very clear that golems were only so intelligent as their creator caused them to be, and I hadn't been trying to make a genius of a cookie. On the other hand, he'd also lasted literally weeks longer than any other cookie I'd animated before. Usually I pulled the magic out of them before we sold them, because no one wants to bite into a live cookie. My God, maybe golems got weird if you left them alive long enough. On the other hand, the cookie surprised me. He walked down my shoulder and studied the hive of activity in the courtyard. He examined the shields being hammered and nodded approvingly. About the buckets and cauldrons and bathtubs of dough, I think they pulled large chunks of the plumbing out of the palace to provide me with places to store the dough. He was less approving. He actually pinched some of the dough between his arms and frowned at it, then shook his head at me. "Too spongy. I know," I said. "Probably horribly bland, but nobody's going to eat it." The cookie gave me a look. You wouldn't think icing could do that, and he waved his arms in the air as if to say, "Well, fine, if you're sure." The blacksmiths were the easiest people to work with. You'd think the cooks would be thrilled to have an active role in defending the city from a Carrick's invasion, and maybe they were, but that did not extend to being happy about a 14-year-old kid taking charge of their kitchen and demanding they do just terrible things to dough. "Let it rise how long?" asked the head cook, scandalized. "And you're baking it where?" "I know," I said wearily. "Believe me, I know. It'll taste terrible." "Nobody's eating it." "Wasted good flour," the cook sniffed. "Now, if you ask me, young lady." Spindle, who had been taking advantage of the cook's distraction to pocket a cold meat pie, part of a ham, and a dozen hard-boiled eggs, turned his head at this. "She didn't ask you," he said. "She's telling you. Duchess's orders, innit?"
I love you, Spindle.
The cook turned the colour of stolen ham. "Spindle," I said, torn between being grateful and being mortified. "It's true," he muttered. I abandoned all hope of the... I just saw the fantastic retort, "You'll taste terrible," in the chat. I like that. I abandoned all hope of the cook liking me. It didn't matter. She was furious, so be it. The Carracks would be a lot worse. I drew myself up as tall as I could. I came to a little under the cook's collarbone and said quietly, "Please fill as many buckets as you can with dough. If you run out, the guards will bring you more. Flour is being brought from the warehouses." "As you say," grated the cook. "Thank you," I said, and left the kitchen, dragging Spindle out with me. However mad the cook was now, it was going to get a lot worse when she counted the eggs. My face felt hot. Having a grown-up mad at me, I mean, here I was, trying to save the city from being overrun by cannibal mercenaries, and I felt sick to my stomach because the cook was mad at me. Being 14 has a lot of drawbacks. The sun was going down. The cookie and Spindle and I sat on the edge of a low stone wall that separated the courtyard from the stable yard and made a meal of eggs and illicit ham. "This is pretty horrible," I said. "Good ham," said Spindle with his mouth full. "Don't know what you're on about." "Not the ham. Everything." "Oh." He swallowed. I watched the blacksmith corps swing shields into position. Argonel said they'd be done tomorrow by noon. The Carracks were supposed to reach the big gates of the city tomorrow evening, but they probably would be too busy setting the outlying buildings to the torch to attack the city proper until daybreak. At the very best estimates, if they'd started marching the minute the message from Gildean was cut off, the army would still be 3 days away when the Carracks arrived. "They've told everybody the Carracks are coming," said Spindle, peeling the shell off his third egg. "Cries on every corner." "How are people taking it?" I asked. Really, what I wondered was how Aunt Tabitha and the customers were taking it. Miss McGrammer probably refused to believe it, and Widow Holloway had to have the criers repeat themselves 3 or 4 times. Brutus might be one of the people who showed up at the gates. We don't have a formal standing militia in the city, but Joshua had said that they were calling on anybody who was able to swing a sword to report to the palace to help man the gates. Spindle shrugged. "About like you'd expect. Some people saying it'll blow over if we pay them off. Most people are doing what they're told." He swallowed. "Even if the Carracks take the old city, they probably won't get very far in the rat's nest, so you and yours want to come in, I'll probably find a place for you." "Thanks, Spindle." I dusted my hands off. "Okay, back to work, I guess." I got a good few hours of sleep that night. I didn't expect to sleep in a bed again until the siege was over, and I'd expected to be too scared to fall asleep, but I did sleep. I didn't even worry that much. I think I managed to shove all the fear down into the background. Sure, I was scared to death, but it didn't do much good to be scared, so I wasn't going to dwell on it when there was work to do. Morning brought one really good change, from my point of view. When I went into the kitchen to get a cup of tea and something for breakfast, the angry cook wasn't there. Instead, Aunt Tabitha! She was elbow deep in a wash tub full of dough. "Well, was I going to let you get killed up here at the palace without me? The orders came down for as much dough as we could make, so once we made it, I came up on the wagon alongside. Your uncle's minding the bakery. Never was much good with the ovens, but he'll keep the place from burning down without us." She freed one arm from the dough and hugged me sideways with it. "But the cook?" "Oh, him," Aunt Tabitha sniffed. "I don't think much of him." From Aunt Tabitha, this was the equivalent of being consigned to the blackest depths of the abyss. I said, "Yeesh," I wondered where she'd buried the body. The various kitchen attendants were working very quickly, with dazed expressions. I don't think the cook had been popular, but Lord knows what they made of Aunt Tabitha. One person, at least, seemed very happy. Jenny, the scullery maid, grinned at me from the far side of the table. "I'm sorry," I said to her. I kind of lied to you when I was here before." "Lord love a duck," she said, flapping her apron. "You're a hero. Told everybody it was you who was in here before, but most of them didn't believe me." She shot a triumphant look around the kitchen where various attendants were pretending not to watch us. "Your aunt's got everything squared away, nice and right and tight," she added. "Not like old sour fingers. She ain't stingy with the food, neither." "No," I said. "Aunt Tabitha is never stingy with food." Frankly, I think Aunt Tabitha feels she was put on this earth to make sure that nobody goes hungry. Are you sure you want to be here? Don't you want to be with your family?" "Don't have any," she said cheerfully. "I'm a foundling. Somebody left me in a basket on the steps of the Sisters of Unrelenting Virtue. If I go back to the convent, I get to spend the next 3 days on my knees praying for mercy or divine intervention or whatnot. And those stone floors are bloody hard." She narrowed her eyes and looked suddenly absurdly ferocious. "And if I'm here, I can help. You'll see. I'm not going to stand around while no Carracks rise through my city. Oh, I said faintly. Well, glad to have you. Aunt Tabitha swept by, patting Jenny on the back and leaving flowery fingerprints on her apron. That nice blacksmith was in here earlier. Said to tell you they're on schedule. I don't think he slept at all last night. She waved towards a plate of biscuits. Here, have some dough. More or less won't matter, and you need to keep your strength up. I sat down and had biscuits with honey and butter, and it was divine. Aunt Tabitha's biscuits have always been better than mine. She says I work the dough too much and then rely on magic to fix it. Brought a friend too, she said, and dropped a soup tureen down on the floor next to me. I turned to look at it. Blorp. Bob! About 2/3 of him anyway, said Aunt Tabitha. I put the pot down and told him you needed help. I guess most of him volunteered. Your uncle's supposed to be feeding the rest, but you know how he is, so I left a whole haddock in the old bucket. Oh, Bob, I'm glad you're here. I put a hand down in the tureen. Bob belched affectionately, and a mushy tentacle of starter rubbed against my fingers. Jenny stared at him, then at me, eyes wide. Is that your familiar? She whispered. Who, Bob? I looked down into the tureen. He's a sourdough starter, I guess. Well, yeah, that's the sort of familiar I'd have. The gingerbread man poked me in the ear and gave me a very severe look. You too, I said. Can a person have multiple familiars? I wasn't clear. Spiraling shadows didn't say. That's amazing, she grinned. I wish I was a magician. Really? Really? She nodded. Never believed all that stupid stuff about wizards. Those stupid posters. You're going to do some amazing magic. I know it. Something on one of the spits was burning and she dashed off to save it. It was nice that someone had confidence in me, even if it was just another girl my own age. I wish I had that much confidence in myself. I finished my biscuits, rubbing my fingers together thoughtfully. Bob had felt sort of soggy. There was a crust of dried flour forming around the edge of the tureen, and that was all. But the spring green man had accused me of throwing acid on him, and he'd had the scars on his face to prove it. And then there was the matter of the dead rats, and... Have to go, Aunt Tabitha, I said. I slid off my stool and gave her a hug. Thanks for bringing Bob. I think we might have a use for him. Tracking down Joshua was harder than I expected. Apparently, he was one of the people in charge of the city's defense now. But when I said it's wizard stuff, the guards got very helpful and stopped trying to give me the brush off. I found him on the far side of the stables, where there's a small drill ground, supervising the newly formed militia. He had a gloomy expression. I looked at the men, and since I had no idea what I was looking for, it just looked like a bunch of guys with wooden poles whacking at targets made out of straw. Are they any good? I asked. Joshua sighed. No. Some of the ex-military ones are alright, but there aren't enough of them. Put those with the guard. The rest... Putting them on the front lines will be murder. I watched one big man throw himself at a target and reduce it to kindling and hanks of straw. He looks pretty good. Joshua shook his head. Armies aren't made of individual fighters. An army is a group of men who fight together as a unit, but it takes a lot longer than 2 days to drill a squad into fighting as a group instead of as a lot of little parts. We don't have the time. He ran a hand through his hair, and he looks so tired. But that's my problem, not yours. What can I do for you, Wizard Mona? This is probably a stupid question, but we're going to be fighting Carracks coming through the gate, right? And there are big walls, and you can put people on top of the walls, right? Yeah. Archers, mostly. People in charge, too, like you and me. The notion that I was one of the people in charge would ordinarily have reduced me to a gibbering wreck. But, like Joshua, I just didn't have that kind of time. Do you ever... Oh, I don't know. Dump boiling oil on them and stuff? He laughed. Boiling oil? More trouble than it's worth. Walls are barely wide enough for 2 men to pass. There's no place to build a fire to boil anything. I'm certainly not having men run up the stairs carrying pots of scalding oil. Why'd you ask? Well, I have this thing saying I have a homicidal sourdough starter. Sounded much too bizarre. It's like magic dough. if you get it mad, it'll attack people. And it will try to dissolve them. And it burned the Spring Green Man really badly. And he was a wizard, and I don't know if it'll help, but if there was a way to fling it down onto them, how long will it last? Asked Joshua. I spread my hands helplessly. I don't know. I've never done this before, but I don't think it could eat a whole person. But I thought maybe if we could throw a whole bunch of little bits. To my surprise, Joshua was nodding. Like burning pitch, he said. It's used sometimes in sieges. Same as your boiling oil. It can kill you if it hits you, but most people only get hit by some of the splash. Bloody hurts, and it slows you down to deal with it. Can't use pitch for the same reason we can't use oil. But if your magic dough doesn't require anything special, just flour and water, then perhaps we can fill jars with it and put it in slings. He nodded. Yeah, that is a good plan. I don't think it'll stop them, you understand. I said, worried. Joshua put a hand on my shoulder. Mona, nobody expects you to stop them single-handedly. Golden General could, I said gloomily. No, he couldn't. I stared at Joshua. He sighed. Mona, did you never wonder why he travels with an army? He throws lightning, certainly. He could no more face the Carracks alone than you could. He just so happens to have 2,000 trained men at his back at all times. If he were here, he'd tell you so himself. Oh, I said, and went back to the kitchens in a speculative frame of mind. "28. I spent most of the day making a whole lot more of Bob. Dough kept arriving from every bakery in the city, wagons full of barrels, oozing with dough, vats full of dough, horse troughs and pots and buckets of dough. The palace servants stacked it up around the edges of the courtyard. I stopped in my tracks when I saw a coffin, lid off, dough creeping over the sides. It was a plain pine box, nothing fancy, but it was still, unmistakably, a coffin. Where did that come from? Church of Sorrowful Angels, said the wagon drover, helping one of the footmen wrestle the coffin off the wagon bed. They ran out of rain barrels. They say it ain't never been used, if you're worried. If we survived this, I was going to have to go find the Church of Sorrowful Angels and talk to their cook. Still, that was a lot of dough. I could probably make half a golem out of that much. But I was talking about making more Bob. Generally, you have to be careful when you add water and flour to a sourdough starter to make sure that you've got the right proportions and all, but in Bob's case, it was easy. I stuck both hands into the soup tureen and tried to convince him that what the world needed was a whole lot more Bob. Now, this coincided with what Bob himself had always believed, so pretty soon I had commandeered a horse trough and had footmen dumping 50-pound sacks of flour into it. I threw in a couple of dead fish as well when no one was looking. By mid-afternoon, Bob filled 6 rain barrels, and here I found an example of what Spiraling Shadows called the magic of sympathy. Despite the fact that they were in separate barrels, they were all still Bob. If I shoved an arm into one barrel and told Bob that he was a good and wonderful sourdough starter, the best starter in the world, all 6 barrels glubbed and belched happily. When I tried to explain about the Carracks, that there were mean people in the world who wanted to hurt me and Aunt Tabitha, and take away Bob's flour, and dead fish, all 6 barrels hissed and glopped, and floury tentacles lashed the air.
I love Bob.
That's not creepy at all, said Spindle, turning up at my elbow. What have you got there? It's only Bob. Well, a lot of Bob. Don't touch him. I rubbed the back of my neck wearily. Where have you been all day? Spindle shrugged. You know, out. Which meant that he didn't want to talk about it. I gave him a mildly curious look, and he flushed. I was looking for Knackery Molly, if you must know. Oh. I'd been so busy I hadn't thought about her. Is she okay? She's fine. Won't come help. He folded his arms tight and led down at his shoes. Says it's not for little people like her. Says she'll get crushed. Told her that we needed her, that there weren't no more wizards but you, but she wouldn't listen. I was disappointed, but I tried not to show it. I think the last war was really hard on her. She went with the army once. They say that's when she went crazy. Just 'cause you're crazy don't mean you can't help. said Spindle, scuffing the ground with his foot. I remembered Uncle Albert saying that if you slap a medal on someone, you don't get to ask questions. You don't have to try and fix what's wrong. Had they given Molly a medal for making the dead horses walk on the battlefield? It was too much. It was just too much. I was 14 years old, and if I didn't get back to work, it wouldn't matter how heroes were made and whether that was good or bad or indifferent. I socked Spindle on the arm. Come and help me get Bob into jars. I'll tell him you're a friend. It took over 100 jars to contain Bob. I think we used the entire stock from the palace. We all had pickled beets and pickled eggs and pickled beef and pickled asparagus for lunch and dinner to free up the jars. And by the end of it, I didn't want to ever see a pickle again. The job was made more difficult because Bob was fighting mad now. I think Spindle dumped a couple of jars of pickled chili peppers into the barrels when I wasn't looking, and was just striking out at strangers, so Spindle and Aunt Tabitha and I were the only ones who could get him into the jars. Jenny, the kitchen maid, was really helpful. She kept finding jars tucked into corners and bringing them out, which was more than the head cook had done. "Oh, him," said Jenny, sniffing. "He went off with a flea in his ear after your aunt told him off. Didn't tell him I brought you the pickled radishes, though. Those were his specialty. He'd be right mad if he knew that you were stuffing dough into all these jars." I was latching the very last lid onto the very last jar when Joshua appeared at my elbow. It was early evening. The sky looked old, and the sky looked bloody over the western walls. "Mona," he said. "They're finishing the oven now," I said, not looking at him. "Another hour to get evenly heated, and we'll start baking." He nodded. "In that case..." Something landed on my shoulder. I let out a squawk and ducked down, and my gingerbread man climbed on top of my head and started waving his arms angrily at my attacker. Joshua, who should have been helping, started to laugh. It was a pigeon. It was a big, glossy grey bird with that subtle, oily iridescence along his neck feathers, but still it was a pigeon. You get them everywhere in town. The pigeon puffed out its chest, looked down its beak at me, which is not the sort of behaviour you expect from a bird that lives in gutters. Joshua finally managed to stop laughing and said, Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I needed that. I think that's one of Annalise's. See if it's got a message." "A message?" I stared at the bird, who was uncomfortably close to my face. The pigeon lifted one foot and had a little capsule strapped to its leg. Using its beak, it removed the capsule and held it out towards me. "Joshua, the bird is giving me something." "It's a messenger pigeon," said Joshua. "Annalise, she's a wizard, travels with the army. She does omen pigeons. Unfortunately, while she can send them here, we can't send them back to her. They're strictly one-way birds. They can find their way home, and that's it. Still, she can usually magic them into finding a specific person." "Shouldn't it be trying to find you, then? Or the Duchess?" "She got one a few hours ago," said Joshua, the laughter fading from his voice. "They got our message. The army is a little more than 3 days away. They're doing a forced march and hope to cut it down, but even an army can't run all the way here." Well, I hadn't had much hope. Felt less like a fist in the gut and more like a confirmation of what I had known all along. The army couldn't save us. The Golden General couldn't save us. It was up to us. The bird shook the message capsule at me. I took it gingerly between my fingers, expecting a peck. There was a note inside. It was written neatly on a sheet of onion skin paper, folded so tightly that an entire sheet could fit into the tiny capsule. I smoothed it out, and it read, "To Mona, the wizard of the bakery, greetings from General Ethan." "Ah, of course. Yeah, okay. The Golden General was sending me letters now. Naturally, this was the next logical step. After this, Our Lady of Sorrowful Angels would step down off her church spire, roll up her sleeves, and begin punching dough alongside Aunt Tabitha." "From Ethan?" asked Joshua. I nodded. "Yeah." "How did he know who I was?" "The Duchess sent a very thorough report with the riders, and you are the only wizard at our disposal. Can't imagine there's too many wizard girls running around the palace right now." Joshua laughed wearily. "Would that there were. A few more like you, we might not need the army." I said, smoothing the creases out of the letter and reading further down. "Her Grace the Duchess informs me that in our city's hour of need, you have stepped forward. You have all my gratitude, Wizard Mona. I implore you, leave no stone unturned in your efforts to save our city. Do not be bound by what seems foolish or impossible. In magic, creativity is as important as knowledge. The greatest wizard I have ever known would have been considered a minor talent by our standards, but he was relentless in finding ways to make things work with what he had. I hope that you will be the same. We will be with you as soon as we can. General Ethan. Pardon me. Its job done, the pigeon launched itself heavily off my shoulder and circled the courtyard, gaining altitude. It vanished over the top of the palace, presumably to some hidden dovecote where the homing pigeons roosted. I folded the note and shoved it into my pocket. I hadn't expected a note from the Golden General in the first place, so it was stupid to feel disappointed that when one arrived, it didn't include handy advice like, by the way, I've hidden the magic superweapon in the third room closet on the left. Still, it would have been nice. You might think that having the Golden General watching over your shoulder, even by homing pigeon, would be daunting. But really, when everybody was going to die if I failed, piling, and the great hero of our army will be very disappointed, on top didn't mean that much. In a way, the letter was actually encouraging. In magic, creativity is as important as knowledge. If anybody knew, it would be him. He was a wizard, after all, and a really well-trained one. If he said that you could do a lot with a little magic, well, you couldn't argue that my bread golems weren't creative. I just had to think of even more creative things to do. We're beginning the eating now, called the blacksmith as the first load of charcoal went into the oven. You can be spared for an hour then, said Joshua, as I turned away from the ovens. Come with me. Carracks have reached the outlying areas. And we'll leave it there. That's 26, 27, and 28.
Double check, but yeah, I think that's it. Try that last line again with a little more finality.
You can be spared for an hour then, said Joshua, as I turned away from the ovens. Come with me. The Carracks have reached the outlying areas. It is on!